The vampire lord of Thornhaven Citadel didn't hire the girl because he trusted her. He hired her because she was the only one desperate enough to take the position. What Casimir Volkov discovered through the surveillance crystals he'd hidden throughout the nursery wasn't just shocking. It shattered the carefully constructed walls around his 800-year-old heart. The cameras were meant to catch negligence, betrayal, or worse. Instead, they captured something far more dangerous. A love so pure it threatened to expose the monster he had become. Welcome back to the Citadel, my cherished listeners. If the mystery of what those cameras revealed has captured your attention, and you're ready to witness how a midnight lullaby in a forgotten tongue could rewrite the fate of an ancient bloodline, then settle in close. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from, because tomorrow I'm bringing you another tale of shadows and redemption that will haunt your dreams. Now, let us begin. The nursery wing of Thornhaven Citadel existed in a state of perpetual twilight. Heavy damask curtains the color of dried blood blocked every window, and the air hung thick with the scent of lavender and decay, a futile attempt to mask the smell of approaching death. Casimir Volkov stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the amber glow of the oil lamps. He was a study in contrasts. Alabaster skin pulled taut over aristocratic features, eyes the color of winter storms, and hands that could crush stone but trembled now as they gripped the doorframe. In the ornate crib at the center of the room lay his son. Mikhail was barely 6 months old, but he looked ancient. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of blood magic could correct. His breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that echoed obscenely in the silence. The finest healers in the immortal realms had examined him, performed their rituals, consulted their grimoires. The diagnosis was always the same: the child was dying. Fading sickness, they called it in hushed tones. A curse of half-bloods, children born to a vampire and a human who could not reconcile the warring magics in their veins. The human half wanted to live. The immortal half wanted to transform. Caught between, the child's body was slowly consuming itself. Mikhail's mother, Casimir's human wife, Elena, had died bringing him into the world. Her last words, whispered through blood-flecked lips, had been a plea: save him. Promise me you'll save him. Casimir had promised. And he had failed. 9 nursemaids in 6 months. Each one had fled, unable to bear the weight of watching an infant die by inches. The last one, a hardened blood witch with 2 centuries of experience, had left 3 days ago. As she'd swept past him toward the iron gates, she'd hissed a single pronouncement: that child is already a ghost. You're not looking for a nursemaid. You're looking for a gravedigger. Casimir had nearly killed her for it. His hand had been at her throat, fangs extended, when he'd heard it, a wet, choking cough from the nursery. Mikhail, struggling to breathe. Struggling to live, despite the witch's cruel prophecy. He'd let her go. And spent the next 72 hours pacing the halls of his citadel like a caged beast, watching his son fade while his court whispered about succession and the weakness of keeping a dying half-blood alive. That was 3 days ago. Now, standing in the doorway at sunset, Casimir made a choice born of desperation rather than hope. He would hire the girl who had appeared at his gates that morning. The strange, thin creature with hollow eyes and calloused hands who had asked, in broken, accented English, if the position was still available. She wasn't qualified. She had no references, no training, no lineage. She'd arrived on foot, her worn shoes held together with wire, her coat too thin for the mountain cold. When his steward had questioned her, she'd simply said, "I am good with babies. I need work. I will stay." The steward had sent her away. Casimir had countermanded the order. Not because he believed she could save Mikhail, but because watching his son die alone was a torture even he could no longer bear. If this girl could offer even a few moments of comfort in Mikhail's final days, that would be enough. Or so he told himself. Zofia Kowalczyk had learned early that the world was not built for people like her. She was 18, though she looked younger. Hunger had a way of stealing years from a face. She'd crossed 3 countries on foot to reach the Thornhaven peaks, following rumors of work in the citadel of the vampire lord. Rumors that most people fled from. Rumors that drew her in like a moth to flame. Because Zofia had nothing left to lose. Her village in the Carpathian foothills was gone, not destroyed in some dramatic conflagration, but simply erased. Poverty so deep it hollowed out the people like husks. Her mother had died when Zofia was 12. Her father had drunk himself to death 2 years later. Her younger brother, Tomasz, had been all she had left. Until the fever took him last winter. She'd held him as he died, singing the old Polish lullabies their mother had taught them. Lalaj Jezuniu, lullaby for baby Jesus. She'd sung until her voice gave out, until his breathing stopped, until the cold claimed him. Afterward, there was nothing. No family. No money. No future. Just the hollow ache of a grief so profound it had calcified into something else entirely. A desperate, reckless need to matter. To help someone. To prove that all the death hadn't been meaningless. When she'd heard about the vampire lord's dying baby, something inside her had stirred. A recognition. She knew what it was to sit vigil beside a child slipping away. She knew the songs that eased the passage. She knew how to be present in the face of death without flinching. So she'd walked. For weeks. Through snow and mud and the suspicious stares of villagers who crossed themselves when they saw her coming. Until she'd stood before the iron gates of Thornhaven Citadel and knocked. Now, following the silent steward through labyrinthine corridors of black marble and flickering torchlight, Zofia felt the weight of the place pressing down on her. This was a fortress built to keep the world out. Every door was iron-banded. Every window was barred. Every shadow felt inhabited. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to ascend into darkness itself, emerging finally into a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. At the end, a pair of carved oak doors stood slightly ajar. The steward stopped. "The nursery," he said, his voice flat. "The master will see you inside." He didn't offer any other warning. Didn't tell her what to expect. Simply turned and descended the stairs, his footsteps fading into silence. Zofia stood alone in the hallway. She could hear something from beyond the doors, a wet, labored breathing that made her chest tighten with recognition. She pushed the doors open. The nursery was more luxurious than any room she'd ever entered. Persian rugs. A crystal chandelier. Toys made of silver and silk. But all of it felt like a mausoleum, beautiful things arranged around an open grave. In the center of the room stood a man who could only be the vampire lord. Casimir Volkov turned as she entered. His eyes swept over her, the threadbare coat, the worn boots, the gaunt face framed by dark hair pulled into a simple braid. She looked like exactly what she was, a girl from nowhere, carrying nothing. "You are the one who came this morning," he said. His voice was a low rasp, melodic in a way that made her skin prickle. Not quite a threat. Not quite a question. "Yes, my lord." Her English was careful, each word measured. Her accent was thick, Polish vowels and consonants that didn't quite fit the shape of the language. "You have experience with children?" She hesitated. Lying would be easy. But something in his eyes, a desperate, barely concealed grief, made her choose truth. "I cared for my brother when he was sick. I was with him when he died." A muscle in Casimir's jaw tightened. "And you think that qualifies you to care for my son?" "No," Zofia said simply. "But I know what it is to sit with someone who is suffering. I know how to be gentle. I know how to sing to make the hours less heavy." For a long moment, Casimir said nothing. He simply stared at her with those storm-gray eyes, and Zofia had the distinct sensation of being dissected. Finally, he moved aside, gesturing toward the crib. "His name is Mikhail," Casimir said, and for the first time his voice cracked. "He is dying. Every healer in my realm has told me there is nothing to be done. His body is rejecting itself, half human, half immortal, wholly incompatible. I'm told he has days. Perhaps a week." Zofia moved slowly toward the crib. Inside, the baby lay propped against silk pillows, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular patterns. His eyes were half closed, glazed with fever. His tiny fists clenched and unclenched as if grasping for something just out of reach. He looked so small, so fragile. so heartbreakingly like Tomasz in those final hours. "Hello, Kochny," Zofia whispered, the Polish endearment slipping out before she could stop it. "Little loved one." She reached into the crib and gently placed her hand over Mikhail's. His skin was cold and clammy, fever-hot and yet somehow lifeless. The baby's eyes flickered toward her. For just a moment, there was a spark, a flash of awareness, of recognition, of something deeper than the fog of sickness. Zofia began to hum, low and soft, an old melody her mother had sung. "Ach, spij Kochny. Sleep, my darling." Mikhail's breathing, which had been harsh and ragged, seemed to ease slightly. His little fingers curled around hers with a strength that seemed impossible for such a frail body. Behind her, Casimir inhaled sharply. "I will stay," Zofia said, not turning around. Her eyes were fixed on the baby, her hand steady in his. "If you will have me, I will sit with him. I will sing to him. I will make sure he is not alone." "The others fled," Casimir said. His voice was raw. They couldn't bear watching him suffer. "Then they did not understand," Zofia said quietly. "Suffering is easier when someone witnesses it. When someone stays." She finally turned to look at the vampire lord. In the amber lamplight, his face looked almost human, lined with exhaustion, shadowed with a grief so profound it had carved new hollows beneath his eyes. "You may stay," Casimir said. The words sounded like they cost him something. "Your quarters are attached to the nursery. You will have access to whatever you need. But understand this." His eyes hardened, the predator reasserting itself. "If you harm him, if you neglect him, if you add one moment of pain to his final days, I will ensure your death is neither quick nor merciful." "I understand," Zofia said. She wasn't afraid. Fear required the belief that you had something left to lose. Casimir turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. The previous nursemaids, they reported that he cries most at night, between midnight and dawn. Nothing soothes him. Not warmth, not feeding, not holding. Just screaming. Until he exhausts himself. "I will be there," Zofia said simply. Casimir left without another word. Alone in the nursery, Zofia pulled a wooden chair close to the crib. She sat down, her hand still resting lightly on Mikhail's chest, and continued to hum the old Polish lullabies. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Casimir hadn't truly left. He'd walked 20 paces down the corridor to a concealed alcove. There, embedded in the walls at strategic points throughout the nursery, were enchanted crystals. Surveillance devices that projected everything they captured into Casimir's private study. He'd installed them after the third nursemaid fled. He needed to know what was happening when he wasn't there. Needed to see if anyone attempted to harm Mikhail, or worse, attempted to ease his suffering with poison disguised as mercy. The cameras had shown him nothing but his son's slow deterioration. 9 women, all of them competent, all of them eventually broken by the weight of witnessing a child's prolonged death. Now, he returned to his study and activated the crystals. The image that appeared, projected in shimmering blue light, was the nursery from a high angle. Zofia in the wooden chair, her hand on Mikhail's chest, her head bowed, her lips moving in silent song. Casimir told himself he was watching to ensure she didn't hurt Mikhail. But as the hours passed and he remained transfixed by the projection, he began to suspect he was lying to himself. The first night, Zofia did not sleep. She stayed in the wooden chair, her hand resting lightly on Mikhail's chest to monitor his breathing. Every few hours, she would stand and stretch, her joints popping in the silence, before settling back into her vigil. At midnight, as the vampire lord had warned, Mikhail began to cry. It started as a whimper, a weak, mewling sound that quickly escalated into a full-throated wail. His little body arched against the pillows, his face contorting with pain that no infant should ever have to endure. Zofia lifted him carefully, supporting his head as she'd learned to do with Tomasz. She held him against her chest and began to walk, her steps measured and rhythmic as she sang. Lalaj Jezuniu, Moja Perelko, Lalaj Jezuniu, Mi Piesadelko. Lullaby Jesus, my little pearl. Lullaby Jesus, my precious one. The words were ancient, worn smooth by generations of Polish mothers singing to their children. They weren't magic, not in the way the vampire healers understood magic, but there was power in them nonetheless. The power of continuity, of tradition, of love distilled into melody. Mikhail's screams gradually subsided into hiccuping sobs. He didn't stop crying entirely, but the edge of panic left his voice. He seemed to recognize, on some primal level, that he wasn't alone, that someone was bearing witness to his pain. Zofia walked circles around the nursery, singing every lullaby she knew. Polish songs her mother had taught her. Ukrainian melodies she'd learned from traveling merchants. Even a few Russian cradle songs she'd picked up in the years after her parents died. By 3 a.m., her voice was hoarse. By 4 a.m., it was barely a whisper. But she didn't stop. And finally, as the first gray hint of pre-dawn touched the edges of the heavy curtains, Mikhail fell into an uneasy sleep. Zofia laid him back in the crib, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She wanted to collapse onto the small cot in the attached servants' quarters. But she didn't. Instead, she pulled the wooden chair closer and sat down, her hand once again resting on Mikhail's chest. She would sleep later. Right now, he needed someone to watch over him. What Zofia didn't know was that every moment of the night had been captured by the surveillance crystals. In his study, Casimir stared at the projection. He'd watched the entire night unfold. Watched the strange, thin girl hold his dying son and sing to him in a language Casimir barely recognized. Watched her walk endless circles, her steps never faltering even as her voice gave out. Watched her choose to stay awake, to remain present, when she could have easily laid the child down and rested. The previous nursemaids had all eventually retreated to their quarters during Mikhail's midnight screaming fits. They'd closed the doors and covered their ears and waited for the storm to pass. This girl, this Zofia, had done the opposite. Casimir felt something twist in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't trust. He didn't trust anyone. But it was curiosity. Interest. The first stirring of something that might, under different circumstances, become respect. He watched as Zofia settled into the chair, her head drooping with exhaustion but her hand never leaving Mikhail's chest. She was going to stay awake. All day. Because she believed his son shouldn't be alone. Casimir reached out and touched the projection, his cold fingers passing through the shimmering image of Zofia's face. "Who are you?" he whispered to the empty study. "And why would anyone choose this?" The pattern repeated the next night. And the next. And the next. Every evening at sunset, Casimir would enter the nursery to check on Mikhail. Every evening, he would find Zofia in the wooden chair, dark circles under her eyes, her face gaunt with exhaustion, but alert and present. She never complained. Never asked for time off. Never requested additional help. When he asked her why she didn't sleep during the night, she simply said, "He needs someone during the worst hours. I can sleep during the day when he is calmer." But through the surveillance crystals, Casimir saw the truth. Zofia never slept during the day either. She would sit in the chair while Mikhail dozed fitfully. She would hum or sing softly even when he was unconscious. She would prepare his feedings with meticulous care, warming the specially prepared blood mixture to exactly the right temperature. She would massage his tiny limbs to keep the muscles from atrophying. And at night, when the screaming began, she would lift him and walk and sing in that broken, beautiful voice. Days blurred into a week. The week stretched toward 2. Mikhail didn't improve. But he also didn't get worse. The grayish pallor remained, the labored breathing continued. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when his eyes would clear and focus on Zofia's face, and something that looked almost like peace would settle over his features. The court noticed. Casimir's generals and advisors began commenting on the unusual nursemaid. Some were skeptical. Surely the dying child was simply being dragged along by false hope. Others were curious. What technique was this peasant girl using that their most skilled healers hadn't tried? Casimir ordered them all to stay away from the nursery. He alone would monitor the girl's work. Through the cameras, always through the cameras. It was the 14th night when everything changed. Casimir had been reviewing reports in his study, the surveillance projection active but peripheral to his attention. Mikhail's midnight screaming had become so routine that Casimir had learned to work through it, letting the sound of Zofia's Polish lullabies provide an odd sort of background comfort. But tonight was different. At 4:17 a.m., according to the timestamp on the projection, Mikhail's screaming reached a new pitch. Not the usual cry of discomfort or fear. This was agony. Pure, unfiltered agony. Casimir's head snapped up. On the projection, he saw Mikhail convulsing in Zofia's arms, his small body rigid with pain. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth. His eyes had rolled back, showing only whites. A seizure. The healers had warned this would happen eventually, the body's final rebellion before the end. Casimir was on his feet, moving toward the door with inhuman speed, when he saw Zofia do something impossible. She laid Mikhail on the floor. Then she laid herself down beside him, nose to nose, her arms wrapped around his convulsing body. And she began to sing. Not a lullaby this time. Something else. A chant. Deep and rhythmic, her voice resonating in a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at something more primal. Sweek, gwiazdecko, sweek dla nai, prawidzko przez simnask, du brzigu, z chika matka, z otwardami ramionami. Shine, little star, shine for me. Guide him through the darkness. To the shore where mother waits. With open arms. It wasn't a song to keep a child alive. It was a song to guide a soul home. Casimir's hand froze on the doorknob. On the projection, Mikhail's convulsions began to ease. His rigid muscles relaxed incrementally. His eyes, still rolled back, began to track toward Zofia's voice. She held him tighter, her forehead pressed against his, her voice never wavering. Nie jesteś sam, kochany, nie jesteś sam. You are not alone, beloved. You are not alone. The seizure passed. Mikhail went limp in her arms, his breathing shallow but steady. Zofia didn't move. She stayed there, on the cold marble floor, holding the baby and continuing to sing softly. Hours passed. Casimir stood in his study, hands still on the doorknob, unable to move. Unable to look away from the projection. As dawn approached and weak gray light began to filter through the curtains, Zofia finally stirred. She lifted Mikhail carefully and stood, swaying with exhaustion. She laid him in the crib, checking his pulse, his temperature, his breathing. Then she returned to the wooden chair and sat down heavily. She didn't close her eyes. She simply sat there, her hand on Mikhail's chest, her lips moving in silent prayer or song. Casimir watched her profile, outlined in the gray dawn light. Her face was hollow with exhaustion, her eyes sunken, her skin pale as death itself. She looked like a ghost. Like someone who had given away so much of herself that there was almost nothing left. And for the first time in 800 years, Casimir felt shame. This girl, this strange, desperate, selfless creature, had been in his citadel for 2 weeks. She had asked for nothing, eaten almost nothing, slept not at all. She had poured every ounce of her remaining strength into comforting a child who was not hers, who could give her nothing in return, who was destined to die anyway. And Casimir had watched it all through cameras. He'd monitored her like a subject under surveillance. He'd looked for weakness, for selfishness, for the inevitable moment when she would falter. He'd found none of it. Instead, he'd witnessed something that terrified him more than any enemy: genuine, unconditional compassion. Casimir let go of the doorknob. He returned to his desk and sat down heavily, his eyes fixed on the projection. Zofia was humming again. That same Polish melody. Her hands steady on Mikhail's chest despite the trembling in her arms. "You're killing yourself," Casimir whispered to the image. "For a child who isn't even yours. For a monster's son. Why?" The projection, of course, offered no answer. But as Casimir sat in the pre-dawn darkness, watching this dying girl keep vigil over his dying son, a realization began to crystallize, cold and sharp as frost. He'd been searching for someone to save Mikhail. But Zofia wasn't trying to save him. She was trying to witness him. To make sure that however brief his life, however painful his existence, he would be seen. It was a gift Casimir had forgotten could exist. and it was destroying her. The morning after Mikhail's seizure, Casimir did something he hadn't done in decades. He dismissed his court obligations entirely and stationed himself in a shadowed alcove near the nursery doors. Not to watch through cameras. To listen. He heard Zofia's voice, that same gentle humming, punctuated by soft words in Polish. He heard the rustle of fabric as she moved around the room, the tiny clink of the silver feeding bottle being prepared, the creak of the wooden chair as she settled in once more. What he didn't hear was sleep. Even the simple pause of someone taking care of their own needs. By noon, his steward approached with a tray of food. For the girl, my lord. She refused breakfast again. And yesterday's dinner was found untouched. Casimir took the tray himself. He pushed open the nursery doors without announcing himself. Zofia was in the chair, Mikhail cradled in her arms. She looked up, startled as Casimir entered. In the full light of day, rare sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains, she looked even worse than she had in the pre-dawn gray. Her cheekbones were sharp enough to cut. Her eyes, though still alert, had taken on a glassy quality. Her hands, visible where they supported Mikhail, trembled with a fine, continuous tremor. "You need to eat," Casimir said. His voice came out harsher than intended. "I will," Zofia replied softly, "after I put him down for his nap." "You said that yesterday. And the day before." Zofia's gaze flickered away from his. "I forget sometimes. When he is restless, I lose track of time." Casimir set the tray on a side table and moved closer. This near, he could hear the irregularity in her breathing. Could see the way her pulse fluttered erratically at her throat, too fast, too weak. "How long has it been since you slept?" he asked. "I sleep," Zofia said. But the lie was transparent. "During the day, when he is calm. The cameras say otherwise." The words were out before Casimir could stop them. Zofia's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "Cameras?" Casimir felt something cold settle in his gut. The fear he'd become so adept at inspiring in others was now being reflected back at him, not as terror, but as betrayal. "Surveillance crystals," he said, forcing his voice to remain level. "Professional. Throughout the nursery. I needed to ensure Mikhail's safety. To monitor his condition when I couldn't be present." Zofia's face had gone very still. The trembling in her hands intensified, but she didn't look away from him. "You have been watching? This whole time?" "Yes." "Everything?" "Yes." For a long moment, Zofia said nothing. She simply stared at him, and Casimir saw something shift behind her eyes. The careful walls she'd maintained, the professional distance of servant and master, crumbled. What remained was raw and wounded. "I see," she whispered finally. She stood, moving carefully to lay Mikhail in the crib. The baby fussed slightly but didn't wake. Zofia's hands lingered on the blanket, smoothing it with mechanical precision. When she turned back to face Casimir, her expression had shuddered completely. "I understand, my lord. You needed to be sure I would not harm him. That I was competent." Her voice was flat, empty of inflection. "Have I passed your test? Or shall I leave now?" "This isn't about a test," Casimir began. "Then what is it about?" Zofia interrupted. Her voice cracked just slightly. "You watched me sing to him. Watched me hold him through the worst hours. Watched me." She trailed off, her jaw working as she fought for composure. "Did it help? Seeing it all through your magical glass? Did it make you feel safer? More in control?" Casimir had no answer. Zofia laughed, a short, bitter sound utterly unlike her usual gentle demeanor. "Of course, I am the fool. To think that any of this was private, sacred." She pressed a hand to her forehead, swaying slightly. "I sang him songs my mother taught me. Songs I sang to my brother when he died. I thought at least here in this room we were just—" She stopped, shaking her head. "But there is no we. There is only a dying baby and a desperate girl and a vampire lord watching from the shadows to make sure she doesn't steal the silver." "That's not—" Casimir took a step forward. Zofia took a step back. "Please. Don't." The word hung between them like a blade. "I need." Zofia's voice fractured. I need a moment. Just a moment. Outside this room. Away from the watching. She moved toward the door, her steps unsteady. Casimir watched her go, every instinct screaming at him to stop her, to explain, to somehow undo the damage his confession had caused. But he didn't move. Because she was right. He had watched her most vulnerable moments through the cold lens of surveillance magic. He had witnessed her grief, her exhaustion, her desperate attempts to give comfort to a dying child, and he had done it from a place of suspicion and control. The door closed softly behind Zofia. Casimir stood alone in the nursery, the only sound Mikhail's shallow breathing. He looked at the crib, at his son, who for the first time in weeks looked almost peaceful, whose gray skin had taken on the faintest hint of warmth. Then he looked at the bronze sconce where one of the surveillance crystals was hidden. With a snarl of self-loathing, Casimir crossed the room and tore the fixture from the wall. The crystal clattered to the floor. He crushed it under his boot, the enchanted glass shattering into powder that glowed briefly before fading to ash. One by one, he found the other crystals. Behind the carved gargoyles. In the hollow eyes of the portraits. Embedded in the crown molding. He destroyed them all. By the time he finished, his hands were bleeding from the crystal shards. The nursery floor was littered with the wreckage of his paranoia. Mikhail woke and began to cry, not the agonized screaming of his worst nights, but a confused, plaintive sound. The sound of a baby who had grown used to being comforted and now found himself alone. Casimir approached the crib slowly. He'd held his son before, of course. Many times. But always with a careful distance, as if emotion were a weakness that might shatter them both. Now, he lifted Mikhail into his arms and held him close. The baby's crying intensified. He squirmed, his small face screwing up in distress. He wanted Zofia. Her warmth, her voice, her gentle presence. Casimir tried to hum one of the lullabies he'd heard through the surveillance feed. But the melody came out harsh and discordant from his throat, and Mikhail only cried harder. I know, Casimir whispered against his son's sparse hair. I know. I've ruined it. I've ruined everything. The door opened. Zofia stood in the doorway, her coat on, her threadbare bag slung over her shoulder. She'd come to say goodbye, Casimir realized. To leave before the next sunset trapped her here for another day. She saw Casimir holding the crying baby. Saw the shattered crystals littering the floor. Saw the blood on his hands. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, slowly she set down her bag. She crossed the room and held out her arms. Not demanding. Simply offering. Casimir handed Mikhail to her. The moment the baby was in her embrace, his crying began to subside. Zofia pressed him close, her hand cupping the back of his head, and began to sing softly. Ac, spij kachani, jak w domu, matka spua, ajsiexua, nie jestis sam, and a jestis sam. Sleep, beloved, as if at home. Mother sings, father watches. You are not alone, you are not alone. Casimir felt something break open in his chest. A grief so profound it threatened to drag him down into darkness. I'm sorry, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. I'm so sorry. Zofia didn't look at him. Her attention remained fixed on Mikhail, who was settling into sleep against her shoulder. Why did you destroy them? She asked quietly. The cameras. Because you were right, Casimir said. What happened in this room, what you gave to my son, it was sacred. And I desecrated it. Zofia finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, but there was something searching in her gaze. You said you needed to know he was safe. I lied. The words tasted like ash. I needed to know I was safe. I needed to maintain control because control is the only thing that has kept me alive for 8 centuries. But watching you... He gestured helplessly at the destroyed crystals. You gave everything. You held nothing back. You trusted that the act of caring was enough, even if it destroyed you in the process. And I couldn't understand it. So I watched from the shadows, trying to find the angle. The weakness. The moment when you would reveal your true motive. And did you find it? Zofia asked. Her voice was very soft. No, Casimir said. There was no angle, No hidden motive. You were exactly what you appeared to be, someone who chose to love a dying child because he deserved to be loved. He looked at Mikhail, sleeping peacefully in Zofia's arms. You gave him more in 2 weeks than I've given him in 6 months. And I repaid you with surveillance and suspicion. Zofia was quiet for a long moment. She swayed slightly, rocking Mikhail with an automatic rhythm. My mother used to say, she began slowly, that suffering shared is suffering halved. But joy shared is joy doubled. She looked at Casimir, and her eyes were ancient despite her youth. You have been alone a very long time, I think. Alone with your suffering. And you forgot that someone can witness you without wanting to wound you. I don't deserve to be witnessed, Casimir said. Perhaps not, Zofia agreed. A ghost of a sad smile touched her lips. But Mikhail does. And I think maybe watching through glass is not the same as being present. Yes. She moved to the crib and laid Mikhail down carefully. He settled without protest, his breathing deep and even. Then Zofia turned back to Casimir. Up close, in the full afternoon light, she looked like a woman on the edge of collapse. Her skin was translucent, her lips bloodless, her entire frame trembling with exhaustion. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to listen without arguing. Can you do that? Casimir nodded, afraid of what was coming. I am dying, Zofia said simply. The words hit like a physical blow. What? Not from illness. From... She searched for the right word. Depletion. I have been giving everything, all my energy, all my warmth, all my life, to Mikhail. Every night when I hold him, I feel myself getting colder, weaker. But he gets a little warmer, a little stronger. She wrapped her arms around herself. I knew from the beginning this would happen. When I heard about your dying baby, I understood what needed to be done. Someone had to be willing to give their life so he could have more time. Someone had to be the bridge. No. Casimir's voice was sharp with denial. No, that's not, you can't. I already am, Zofia interrupted gently. Look at me. Really look. Casimir forced himself to see what he'd been avoiding. The gray tinge to her skin. The way she moved as if underwater. The flutter of her pulse, growing fainter by the day. She was fading. Just like Mikhail had been fading. But in reverse. How long? He managed to ask. I don't know. Days maybe. Perhaps a week if I'm strong. Zofia's expression was calm, accepting. But Mikhail will live. He's getting stronger. I can feel it. Whatever is wrong in his blood, it's being balanced. By the time I'm gone, he'll be stable enough to survive without me. Absolutely not. Casimir's voice cracked with a rage born of helplessness. I won't allow it. I'll find another way. I'll bring in more healers, You'll what? Zofia asked. Force me to stop caring for him? Lock me away? I am already dying, my lord. I have been dying since my brother passed and left me with nothing. At least this way, my death means something. At least this way, I'm not alone. You're not alone now, Casimir said desperately. I see you. Not through cameras, but... He gestured helplessly. I see you. Zofia's eyes filled with tears. Do you? Or do you see a convenient sacrifice? A peasant girl who solves your problem by dying in place of your son. The accusation hit its mark. Casimir recoiled as if struck. He had no defense. Because part of him, the cold, calculating part that had kept him alive through centuries of political intrigue, had already done the math. One life for another. A stranger's death to save his bloodline. It was the kind of trade he would have made without hesitation a few months ago. But now, looking at Zofia's gaunt face and trembling hands, the thought filled him with a revulsion so intense it threatened to choke him. No, he said finally. That's not what I see. I see a woman who has already given more than anyone should ever have to give. I see someone who deserves to be fought for just as fiercely as my son. He took a step closer. Let me help you. Please. There must be a way to save both of you. Why? Zofia asked. The question wasn't hostile. Just curious. Genuinely confused. Why would you fight for me? I am nobody. A girl from a village so small it doesn't even have a name. I have no family, no skills, no future. Why would my life matter to you? Because you matter to him, Casimir said, looking at Mikhail. My son knows your voice better than he knows mine. He finds peace in your arms that he's never found in his own father's. You've become... He struggled for the words. You've become part of him. Part of us. And I... He stopped. The confession lodged in his throat like a stone. But Zofia waited. Patient. Present. The way she'd been present for Mikhail through all those long nights. I don't want to watch anyone else I care about die, Casimir finished quietly. Zofia's breath caught. Care? I don't know when it happened, Casimir admitted. Maybe the first night, when you chose to hold him through the screaming instead of running like the others. Maybe when I watched you lay on the floor beside him during his seizure, singing him toward peace instead of fighting uselessly for survival. Or maybe... He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her hand. Maybe it was today, when you looked at me with such hurt in your eyes and I realized I would rather face any enemy than see that expression again. Zofia stared at their hands, his pale and cold, hers warm but trembling. I'm not your enemy, she whispered. I know, Casimir said. But I treated you like one anyway. I trusted cameras more than I trusted you. And now... He squeezed her hand gently. Now I'm asking you to trust me. Let me try to save you. Both of you. Please. For a long moment, Zofia was silent. Then, slowly she nodded. How? She asked simply. Casimir had no answer. But for the first time in 6 months, he felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I will find a way. I swear it. The vampire lord of Thornhaven Citadel had amassed more magical knowledge in 8 centuries than most scholars encountered in a lifetime. His library contained grimoires in dead languages, blood treaties with entities best left unnamed, and enough dark magic to raise kingdoms. But none of it, none of the power he'd hoarded like a dragon's treasure, told him how to save a dying girl who was giving her life away one lullaby at a time. Casimir spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of research. He summoned every healer, every blood witch, every ancient creature who owed him a debt. He tore through his archives, reading until his eyes burned, searching for anything, any precedent, any ritual, any hint of a solution. The answer was always the same. What Zofia was doing was impossible. Life couldn't be transferred like water from one vessel to another. The very concept violated the fundamental laws of blood magic. And yet it was happening. Mikhail was growing stronger while Zofia faded. On the 4th day, a blood witch named Svetlana, ancient even by vampire standards, provided the first real insight. It's not magic, she said, her voice like dry leaves. Not in the way you understand it. The girl isn't casting spells or performing rituals. She's resonating. Resonating? Casimir repeated. Svetlana gestured with a gnarled hand. Your son is caught between 2 states, mortal and immortal. His body is a battlefield where opposing forces tear him apart. But this girl, she's... The witch paused, searching for words. She's harmonizing with him. When she holds him, sings to him, pours her attention into him, she's not transferring life. She's reminding his body how to live. She's teaching the warring parts to coexist. Then why is she dying? Casimir demanded. Because teaching requires sacrifice, Svetlana said simply. She's not giving him her life force directly. She's spending her own energy to hold him stable while his body learns to hold itself. It's like... She made a cradling gesture. Like holding a broken pot together while the glue sets. Eventually, the pot will hold on its own. But the person doing the holding will be exhausted beyond recovery. Casimir's hands clenched into fists. There must be a way to share the burden. To help her. Svetlana studied him with milky eyes. There is. But you won't like it. Tell me. You could hold her the way she holds your son, the witch said. Be present. Pour your strength into her. Remind her body how to live while she's reminding his. A thin smile crossed her withered face. But that would require trust, vulnerability, and actual emotional connection. Things I've never known you to be capable of, Casimir Volkov. The witch left. Her parting words echoed in the silence of Casimir's study. Remind her body how to live. He thought of the surveillance crystals, of the distance he'd maintained, of the walls he'd built around himself over 8 centuries. Then he thought of Zofia on the floor, holding his seizing son, singing him toward peace. She had trusted completely, had given without reservation, had made herself utterly vulnerable for the sake of a child who wasn't even hers. Could he do the same? Casimir returned to the nursery that evening to find Zofia asleep in the wooden chair. It was the first time he'd seen her unconscious. She'd finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, her hands still resting on Mikhail's crib as if she couldn't bear to break contact even in sleep. Mikhail was awake, watching her with solemn eyes. When Casimir approached, the baby made a soft cooing sound, not distressed, just aware. "She's killing herself for you," Casimir whispered to his son. "And I don't know how to stop it." Mikhail reached out a tiny hand toward Zofia's face, his fingers uncurling. The gesture was so achingly tender that Casimir felt something crack in his chest. His son loved her. This strange, desperate girl had become the center of Mikhail's small world in just 3 weeks. And Casimir, who had spent 8 centuries learning to love nothing, trust no one, and maintain perfect control, realized he was falling too. Not in the way poets wrote about. Not with grand gestures or declarations. But quietly, desperately, like a drowning man reaching for anything that might keep him above water. Zofia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented for a moment, then saw Casimir and started to rise. "Stay," he said quickly. "Please. You need rest." "Mikhail is fine. I'm here." Zofia settled back into the chair, though her body remained tense. "You found something. In your research. I can see it in your face." Casimir knelt beside the chair, bringing himself to her eye level. This close, he could see the fine tremor in her eyelids, the way her breath came shallow and quick. She was deteriorating faster now. "I spoke with a blood witch," he said. "She told me what you're doing to Mikhail. How you're teaching his body to harmonize instead of war with itself. And?" Zofia's voice was barely a whisper. "And she said there's a way to help you. To share the burden." He took a breath. "But it requires me to do for you what you're doing for him. To be present. To give without reservation. To..." He struggled with the words. "To trust." Zofia's eyes widened. "I don't understand." "Neither do I entirely," Casimir admitted. "But I'm willing to try. If you'll let me." For a long moment, Zofia simply stared at him. Then, slowly she nodded. That night, when Mikhail began his usual midnight crying, Casimir stayed. He watched as Zofia lifted the baby, as she began to walk and sing. He watched her steps grow unsteady, watched her voice crack with exhaustion. And then he stepped forward. "Let me," he said quietly. Zofia turned, surprise evident in her face. "My lord. Let me hold him while you sit. You're about to collapse." "But he won't. He doesn't know your voice, you're..." "Then teach me," Casimir said. "Please." Slowly, carefully, Zofia transferred Mikhail into Casimir's arms. The baby immediately began to fuss, his cries intensifying. "Sing to him," Zofia instructed, settling into the wooden chair. "The lullaby. The one in Polish." "I don't know the words." "Then I'll sing and you'll walk. Together." So Casimir walked, holding his son, while Zofia sang from the chair. Her voice was barely audible, worn to a thread, but Mikhail responded to it. The screaming subsided into whimpers. They continued like that for an hour. Then two. At some point, Casimir felt it, a subtle shift. Mikhail's body relaxing in his arms. The baby's breathing synchronizing with his own unnaturally still heartbeat. And something else. A warmth spreading from the child into Casimir's chest. Not heat exactly, but presence. Connection. The feeling of being needed in a way that had nothing to do with fear or obligation. "Keep walking," Zofia whispered. You're doing it. You're helping him remember. By 4 a.m., Mikhail had fallen asleep. But Casimir didn't stop walking. Because he could see Zofia in the chair, her eyes half closed, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. Now it's your turn, he said quietly. Zofia's eyes opened. What? You've given everything to him. Now let someone give to you. Casimir laid Mikhail carefully in the crib, then turned to Zofia. Will you trust me? She hesitated. Then, slowly she nodded. Casimir crossed to her and, with infinite care, lifted her from the chair. She weighed almost nothing. Her body had consumed itself trying to keep Mikhail alive. He carried her to the small cot in the servants' quarters and laid her down. Sleep, he said. I'll watch over him. But if he wakes, then I'll hold him and sing badly until you wake up to save us both. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Sleep, Zofia. Please. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, finally, she allowed her eyes to close. Within minutes, she was asleep, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who had been running on empty for weeks. Casimir stood watch over both of them. His son in the crib, the girl who'd saved them both on the cot. And for the first time in 8 centuries, he didn't feel alone. The pattern shifted over the next week. Casimir no longer watched from the shadows or through magical surveillance. He stayed in the nursery. He learned to hold Mikhail properly, to warm the feeding bottles, to walk the right rhythm when the baby grew fussy. He learned the Polish lullabies phonetically, though his accent was atrocious. Zofia would laugh, a soft, tired sound, and correct his pronunciation. And every night, he would insist she sleep for at least a few hours while he took the first vigil. It wasn't enough. Zofia was still fading, but the decline had slowed. More importantly, something else was happening. Mikhail was healing. The grayish tinge to his skin was fading, replaced by a healthy pink. His breathing grew deeper, steadier. The seizures stopped entirely. By the end of the second week, he was smiling, reaching for things, making the bright babbling sounds of a healthy infant. The court physicians were baffled. They ran tests, performed examinations, consulted their grimoires. Nothing in vampire medicine could explain the reversal. But Casimir understood. Mikhail had needed 2 things to survive: someone to teach his body how to harmonize with itself, and someone to give him a reason to want to live. Zofia had provided the first. And Casimir, learning slowly, clumsily, but sincerely, was beginning to provide the second. On the 15th night, as Casimir sat in the wooden chair holding his sleeping son, Zofia stood by the window looking out at the mountain peaks. He's going to survive, she said softly. I can feel it. Whatever was broken in him, it's healing. Because of you, Casimir said. Because of us, Zofia corrected. She turned to look at him. You were right what you said. About being present making the difference. He needed both of us. Someone to hold the space. And someone to fill it with love. Casimir felt the words settle in his chest like stones. And what about you? He asked quietly. Who holds the space for you? Zofia's expression softened into something achingly sad. I told you. I've been dying since my brother passed. This was always how it was going to end. At least this way, it means something. No. Casimir stood, laying Mikhail carefully in the crib. He crossed to Zofia and took her hands in his. They were cold now, almost as cold as his own. No. You don't get to decide your life means less than his. You don't get to disappear quietly just because you think you're not worth fighting for. I'm not. You are, Casimir interrupted fiercely. You're worth fighting for. Worth staying for. Worth. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Zofia looked up at him with those ancient, exhausted eyes. Worth what? Worth loving, Casimir finished quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. Zofia's breath hitched. You don't mean that. I do. Casimir tightened his grip on her hands. I've watched you give everything to a child who wasn't yours. I've watched you sing to him in the darkest hours. I've watched you choose to stay when anyone else would have run. And I've realized something. He paused, making sure she was really hearing him. 8 centuries I've lived, and I never understood what it meant to be brave. I thought it was about strength, control, the ability to dominate. But you... He shook his head in wonder. You showed me that real bravery is choosing to love something fragile, knowing it might break, and doing it anyway. Tears began to track down Zofia's gaunt cheeks. I don't know how to let someone care for me. Neither do I, Casimir admitted. But maybe we can learn together. He pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of how fragile she'd become. She was shaking, from exhaustion, from emotion, from the slow cold creeping through her body. But she didn't pull away. I'm so tired, she whispered against his chest. I know. I don't think I have much time left. Then let me hold you, Casimir said. The way you've held us. Let me be present. Let me witness you. Let me... He struggled for the words. Let me remind you that you're worth staying for. Zofia looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something that broke his heart. Hope. Fragile, desperate, terrified hope. How? She whispered. Casimir thought of the Blood Witch's words. Be present. Pour your strength into her. Remind her body how to live. Come with me, he said. Casimir led Zofia to his private chambers, a place no one had entered in decades. The room was sparse, almost monastic. Stone walls. A simple bed. Shelves lined with books. Zofia looked around, confused. Why? Because the nursery is Mikhail's space, Casimir said. And this needs to be about you. He guided her to sit on the bed, then knelt before her. The position, a vampire lord on his knees before a peasant girl, would have been scandalous if anyone had witnessed it. But there were no cameras here. No surveillance. Just 2 people, alone in the dark. I need you to understand something, Casimir said. What I'm about to offer, it's not a cure. It won't make you immortal or heal you instantly. But it might give you time. Strength. A chance. What are you offering? Zofia asked. My blood, Casimir said simply. Zofia's eyes widened. But that would turn me. No, Casimir interrupted. Not enough to turn you. Just enough to... He searched for the words. Just enough to anchor you. To give your body something to hold on to while it remembers how to sustain itself. I don't understand. Casimir took her hand and pressed it to his chest, where his heart beat once every few minutes. A slow, cold rhythm. You've been pouring yourself into Mikhail, teaching his body to hold itself together. But there's nothing holding you together. Nothing keeping your life force from just bleeding away. He looked at her intently. My blood is old. Concentrated. It doesn't bring life, but it sustains. It endures. If I give you some, it might act as a foundation. Something for your own life force to rebuild around. Why would you do this? Zofia whispered. Your blood is precious. Powerful. Why give it to me? Because, Casimir said simply, I don't want to live in a world where you're not in it. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Zofia was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly she nodded. I trust you. Those 3 words, I trust you, hit Casimir harder than any weapon. Because he knew what they meant. She was placing her life, her fate, her very soul in his hands. And he would not fail her. This will hurt, he warned. Not the bite, but the blood itself. It will feel cold. Foreign. Your body will fight it at first. I know pain, Zofia said quietly. I can bear it. Casimir cupped her face gently, tilting her head to expose the pale column of her throat. Her pulse fluttered there, weak, irregular, but still fighting. Tell me if it becomes too much, he said. Promise me. I promise. Casimir leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But Zofia remained still, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. His fangs extended, not in hunger, but in something that felt almost sacred. A sacrament. A covenant. He bit down carefully, precisely into the vein at her throat. Zofia gasped but didn't pull away. Casimir tasted her blood first, warm, sweet, alive in a way that made his ancient heart ache. It sang with the echoes of the lullabies she'd sung, the prayers she'd whispered, the desperate love she'd poured into his son. Then he pulled back and bit his own wrist, tearing the vein open. "Drink," he said, pressing his wrist to her lips. "Take what you need." Zofia hesitated only a moment before her lips closed around the wound. The effect was immediate. Casimir felt it, the connection forming. Not the bond of maker and vampire. Something else. Something older and stranger. A resonance, like two bells struck in harmony. His blood flowed into her, cold, ancient, powerful. It carried centuries of endurance, of survival, of will. Not life, exactly, but the refusal to yield. The stubborn determination to continue existing despite everything. Zofia's body fought it. She convulsed slightly, her hands clutching at his arm. But she didn't pull away. "Hold on," Casimir thought desperately. "Hold on. Let me give you what you've given us. Let me be the strength that keeps you here." Time stretched. Seconds became minutes. Casimir wasn't sure when the exchange shifted from physical to something deeper, but suddenly he was aware of her. Not just her body, but her essence. Her grief and exhaustion and desperate hope. The weight she'd been carrying alone. And she was aware of him too. His 8 centuries of loneliness. His fear of connection. His carefully constructed walls crumbling in the face of her gentle, persistent presence. They were holding each other up, literally and metaphorically, each providing what the other needed most, the reminder that they didn't have to carry their burdens alone. Finally, carefully, Casimir pulled his wrist away from her mouth. Zofia slumped against him, her breathing ragged. But her pulse, he could feel it under his fingers, was stronger. Steadier. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "Strange," Zofia whispered. "Cold. But also, solid. Like I have a floor under me again." "It will take time to integrate," Casimir said. "Your body needs to learn to work with my blood rather than against it. But you should start regaining strength over the next few days." Zofia pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were brighter than they'd been in weeks. "Why does this feel different? I thought vampire blood was supposed to turn you." Casimir finished. "It does, if given with the intent to create a vampire. But I didn't give it with that intent. I gave it with the intent to preserve your humanity. To give you time to heal." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You'll probably develop some minor vampiric traits. Better night vision. Slightly enhanced strength. An aversion to sunlight for a few weeks. But you'll remain human. Mortal. Yourself." "And the connection I felt?" Zofia asked softly. "Between us. That was real." "Yes," Casimir admitted. "My blood recognizes yours now. I'll always be able to find you. And you'll always know on some level where I am. He searched for the right word. "It's a tether. Not binding. But present." Zofia absorbed this. Then slowly she smiled. It was the first genuine smile Casimir had seen from her. Not the careful, professional expression she wore in the nursery, but something real and unguarded. "Good," she said. "I don't want to be alone anymore." "Neither do I," Casimir said. He helped her lie down on the bed, tucking blankets around her. She was already drifting towards sleep, the deep, healing sleep her body desperately needed. "Stay," she murmured as her eyes closed. "Please." So Casimir stayed. He sat beside the bed, his hand covering hers, and watched as the colors slowly began to return to her cheeks. As her breathing deepened. As the terrible trembling that had plagued her for weeks finally eased. And for the first time in 8 centuries, the vampire lord of Thornhaven Citadel felt something that terrified him more than any enemy: contentment. The change in the citadel was gradual but undeniable. Over the next 2 weeks, as Zofia regained her strength and Mikhail continued to thrive, the oppressive atmosphere that had haunted Thornhaven began to lift. It started in the nursery. That room which had been a tomb became something else entirely. Light for one thing. Casimir ordered the heavy curtains removed and replaced with shuttered windows that could be opened during the day. Sunlight, carefully controlled to protect him from direct exposure, began to filter into the space. Zofia, under the influence of vampire blood, found she could tolerate reduced sunlight better than expected. She would sit in the dappled light with Mikhail in her arms, singing to him in Polish while Casimir watched from the shadows. The court noticed. Whispers spread through the citadel. The dying baby was not only surviving but thriving. The mysterious peasant girl hadn't fled or died. She'd somehow become a permanent fixture. And the vampire lord, known for his cold detachment, spent every evening in the nursery instead of his throne room. Some of the older vampires disapproved. A few even dared to voice their concerns to Casimir directly. "My lord," his chancellor said one evening, "the court grows uneasy. There are questions about the appropriateness of keeping a human so close to the heir. About the influence she might have." Casimir, who was reviewing reports at his desk while simultaneously keeping one ear on the sounds from the nursery, where Zofia was giving Mikhail his evening feeding, looked up with eyes that had gone very cold. "Questions," he repeated softly. The chancellor swallowed. "Questions about succession. About the proper raising of a vampire heir. About whether attachment to a mortal is wise." "Attachment," Casimir said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is what kept my son alive. That mortal girl did what your physicians and blood witches and ancient healers could not. She taught Mikhail's body to sustain itself through nothing more than presence and devotion. So when you speak of appropriateness, perhaps you should first demonstrate that the court has any understanding of what true power looks like." The chancellor bowed and retreated quickly. But the message spread. The vampire lord was not only protective of the girl, he was devoted to her. And anyone who threatened her would face consequences. Zofia felt the change in how the citadel's inhabitants looked at her. No longer dismissive or suspicious, they now offered cautious respect. Some even nodded in greeting when she passed. But the real transformation was happening within the nursery itself. Mikhail, now nearly 8 months old, was developing at a pace that astounded everyone. He could sit up unassisted. He babbled constantly in a mixture of sounds that seemed to pull from both Zofia's Polish and Casimir's Russian-accented English. He reached for both of them with equal enthusiasm. But there were subtle differences in how he interacted with each. With Zofia, he was gentle. He would nestle into her arms and listen to her sing, his eyes tracking her face with rapt attention. With Casimir, he was playful, curious. He would grab at his father's fingers with surprising strength, laughing when Casimir made exaggerated expressions or deep rumbling sounds. "He knows," Zofia said one evening, watching father and son play a game where Casimir would pretend to drop a silk scarf and Mikhail would shriek with delight. "Knows what?" Casimir asked, catching the scarf and making it fly through the air. "That he's loved by both of us. Differently, but equally." Zofia smiled. "He doesn't have to choose. He can be both things, the part of him that needs gentleness and the part that needs strength." Casimir looked at her over Mikhail's head. "Like he's both mortal and immortal. The parts don't war anymore because we've shown him they can coexist." "Exactly," Zofia said softly. A comfortable silence fell. Mikhail eventually tired himself out and fell asleep in Casimir's arms. Together, they laid him in the crib, no longer the ornate, sterile prison it had been, but a cozy nest of soft blankets and simple wooden toys. As they stood side by side looking down at the sleeping child, Casimir felt Zofia's hand slip into his. He looked at her in surprise. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd grown comfortable with each other, but physical affection beyond what was necessary for the blood exchange had been careful, measured. "Thank you," Zofia said quietly. "For saving me. For letting me stay. For—" She gestured around the nursery. "For all of this. You're the one who saved us," Casimir corrected. "I just finally learned to stop watching from the shadows and actually participate." Zofia tilted her head, studying him. "Do you miss them? The cameras?" "No," Casimir said immediately. Then he paused, considering. "That's not entirely true. Part of me does miss the illusion of control. The safety of distance. But—" He squeezed her hand gently. "Being present, truly present, is infinitely better. Infinitely more terrifying. But better." "Terrifying," Zofia repeated with a small smile. "Yes, that's the right word." They stood there in the quiet nursery, hands linked, watching Mikhail sleep. The moments stretched, perfect and fragile. Finally, Zofia spoke again. What happens now? What do you mean? Mikhail is healed. Stable. He doesn't need constant care anymore. Zofia's voice was carefully neutral. Soon he'll need a proper tutor. A vampire tutor who can teach him about his heritage. And I. She trailed off. You'll stay, Casimir said firmly. If you want to. Not as a servant or a nursemaid, but as... He paused, searching for the right word. As family. Zofia's breath caught. Family? Mikhail loves you, Casimir said. You're the first voice he remembers. The first comfort he knew. He'll always need you, even when he's grown. And I. He turned to face her fully. I need you too. Not because you're useful. Not because you fixed something broken. But because you've become. He struggled with the admission. You've become the first person in 8 centuries that I want to be present for. That I want to know. That I. He stopped, the final word lodging in his throat. That you what? Zofia prompted gently. That I love, Casimir finished quietly. The confession hung in the air between them. Zofia's eyes filled with tears, not sad tears, but something else. Something that looked like wonder. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since you knelt in the nursery and destroyed the cameras. Since you chose to be vulnerable instead of safe. Casimir reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was gentle despite his strength, the same gentleness she'd shown Mikhail in those early nights. May I kiss you? He asked. In answer, Zofia rose on her toes and closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft, tentative. Nothing like the dramatic passion of stories. But it felt like a promise, like two people agreeing to continue learning how to be present for each other, even when it was terrifying. When they finally pulled apart, Zofia was smiling. What will the court say? I don't care, Casimir said honestly. They can whisper all they want. They can plot and scheme and question my judgment. But they can't make me unsee what I've learned. That control is an illusion. That vulnerability is strength. That love. He touched her face again, marveling at the warmth. That love is the only thing that actually matters. Even for a vampire lord? Zofia teased gently. Especially for a vampire lord, Casimir corrected. Because we're the ones who forget most easily. We live so long that we start to believe we're above the things that make life meaningful. But you reminded me. Every night you sang to my son. Every moment you chose to stay when you could have run. You reminded me that the only real power is the power to connect. To care. To love despite the certainty of loss. Zofia leaned into his touch. I'm still mortal, she said softly. Even with your blood, I'll age. I'll die, eventually. Probably decades before you're even considered middle-aged by vampire standards. I know, Casimir said. And I'll grieve when that day comes. But I'd rather have decades of this. He gestured between them. Then centuries of watching from behind glass. A sound from the crib made them both turn. Mikhail had woken and was watching them with solemn eyes. Then slowly he smiled, a bright, gummy smile that lit up his entire face. He reached out both hands. One toward Zofia. One toward Casimir. They moved together, each taking one of his small hands. And in that moment, standing in the nursery that had been transformed from a tomb to a home, Casimir understood something fundamental. This was what he'd been missing for 8 centuries. Not just love, though that was part of it, but wholeness. The sense of being part of something larger than himself. The family, strange and unconventional and utterly imperfect. But real. Present. Alive.